Hello, I'm your instructor, Bernard Norcott-Mahany, and we're going to look at 5 things from Chapter 9, the chapter that deals with Dionysus. So Dionysus is the god of wine and of theater. Tragedies and comedies, what are called old comedies, the comedies of the 5th century, were performed at the city Dionysia in late March. So there was a big festival, week-long festival that was held in late March in honor of Dionysus, and 4 days were devoted to plays. There were 3 days of tragedies, 1 day for each of the 3 tragedians who was picked, and then a final day of 5 comedies from 5 different comic playwrights. Comedies were a lot more expensive to produce. They required a lot more sort of effort and training, probably. And so as a result, comic playwrights would produce a play a year as opposed to the tragedians who would produce 4 plays a year, the 3 tragedies and a satyr play. So, and this was, as I said, in March. There was another festival called the Lanaya, which was a winter festival that had comedies in it as well. The literary selection in Chapter 9 is much of Euripides' Bacchae. I don't think it's the entire play, but it's most of it, which is good because in the first edition only had a single section from the play, and I think it's tough to really appreciate the play unless you really get it, the whole thing or most of it. This was one of Euripides' last plays. It was actually performed posthumously, so he died in 406 BCE. It was performed probably in 404 BCE with the Iphigenia at Aulis, which we also have, and 2 other plays which we do not have. So the interesting thing about it is that Greek tragedy started as choral poems for Dionysus. So a choir sung a song about Dionysus. Then one of the chorus members split off and became a character portraying Dionysus and then would interact with the chorus. Gradually then there became 2 actors and finally 3 actors who would play all the roles, and then you still had the chorus. Of the 33 or 34 tragedies that we have surviving, only 1 deals with Dionysus, and that is the Bacchae. So it's interesting because since it started from worship of Dionysus, we only really have 1 play. I mean, it's not the only play that was written about Dionysus or his worship. We know there were tragedies about Ariadne, which would, of course, involve Dionysus, but we don't have those. So, again, it's just sort of peculiar, and that it comes at the end. It is one of the times that Euripides won first prize. He only won first prize 4 times in his life. He was a popular tragedian, but he wasn't as popular as Sophocles, who was probably the most popular, or even Aeschylus. So he's definitely the 3rd of the 3, and generally he would take sort of rather controversial approaches. Now this play, is it anti-religion? That's one way to read the play, that it's actually an attack on religion and the excesses that religion can lead to, or is it actually a more respectful play about Dionysus showing his power? It's tough to know. The fact that it won first prize, it came at a time when Athens was at its lowest point. It seems unlikely that Athenians would have voted this play and the other plays that Euripides, that were performed in that 404 year, just because, you don't vote for controversial stuff when you're in crisis. So I think the ancients seem to have seen this more as a sort of play honoring Dionysus rather than attacking ecstatic religion. One thing I do want to call your attention to is a feature of most of the Euripides plays we have, and we have basically 19 plays, and that is the prologue. So Euripides, unlike the other tragedians, began pretty much every play that we have, and probably most of the plays that he wrote, where a character in the drama comes out and delivers a prologue. In some cases, that prologue is specifically aimed at setting the record straight, because Euripides is going to take the myth in a totally different direction from what had been the norm. So, for instance, in his play Electra, Electra is married to a farmer. In most versions, she's not married at all. She's basically been kept from getting married. But in this one, she's married to a farmer, so that any children she might have would be of low birth and therefore no threat to the throne. That's a totally different direction, right? No one else is thinking in those terms. We have 3 plays that deal with Electra, and of the 3, this is the one that's the furthest in left field. So you need the prologue. The farmer comes out and basically explains the situation. Electra's married to him, blah, 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 blah. Otherwise, the audience would be saying, who's this guy? Why is he on here? Why do we have a farmer? What's going on? So the prologue sets that up. Here, the prologue is delivered by Dionysus himself, and some of the prologues are delivered by gods. He is disguised as his own priest, so he comes out in human form. He doesn't come out wearing these high boots with platform heels that the gods would wear when they showed up, or he's not swung in on a crane, which is the other way that gods often appear on stage. He just walks out like anyone else, and then he delivers the prologue. And the prologue just sets up the situation. I've returned to Thebes. The king of Thebes is, opposing my worship. I'm going to get him. Right, and that's basically the setup, and then we see how that plays out in the play. So this prologue doesn't really break any new ground. It follows the sort of the myth as Euripides had it, and as the people before had it. So he's not doing anything really, bold here or new, and that might be part of the reason why the Athenians liked it in the Iphigenia at Aulis, is that he's not sort of doing something very strange. The scholarship in Chapter 9 is a part of an article by Eric Zappo called Riding the Phallus for Dionysus. And what Zappo is going to look at is he's going to look at myth. Chapter 8 looked at myth in terms of initiation. So it looked at myths of ritual of elevation, where you enter in at one state and you come out a different state. You enter a boy, you come out a man. You enter a girl, you come out a woman. You enter a single person, you come out married, right? So those types of rituals. This is going to look at myth and its connection to rituals of inversion. These are not meant to be permanent. So in other words, rituals of inversion turn the norm of society topsy-turvy. So in this particular case, one of the things is that the male figure is riding the phallus, rather as if he is going to be mounted by the phallus. So not the sort of male in charge during sex role, but rather the male figure here being used as a sexual object in the ritual. Now, that inverts the norm. The norm, of course, is for the man to be in charge in ancient Greece, but here in this ritual he's not. But the thing is, it's 3 days to a week of ritual, and then you're back to normal. So it's a temporary disruption, and it does not overturn the situation. The comparison section is a poem by Catullus, Catullus 63. Catullus's poems don't have titles; they have the numbers. And the numbers, the 60s, are long poems. The poems after that are elegiac couplets, and the poems before it are various lyric poems. But the 60 poem 61 to 68 are long poems. They're in dactylic hexameter, the meter of epic poetry, and they tell stories. And Catullus 63 tells the story of Attis. So Attis is the first worshiper of Cybele. The priests of Cybele were castrati. So if you were going to become a priest of Cybele, you had to be castrated. So that was the norm. The Romans, Catullus is a Roman poet, the Romans have a really, they don't like castration. There's something that sort of really sets them on edge. Now, Catullus is a very liberal Roman poet. He has no problem with sexual profligacy. He doesn't seem to have any problem with homosexual activity. There are lots of things about Catullus where he's very liberal, but he seems to draw the line at castration. And so in this poem, the interesting thing is it starts, the first 10 lines are Attis coming from Greece to Phrygia, right in Asia Minor, where Cybele was in charge, to be a follower of hers. The ritual starts, the ritual goes wild, he castrates himself, he dances wildly, and then he passes out. That happens in about 10, 15 lines of the poem. The poem's like 80 lines long. So the first less than a quarter of the poem, he's already castrated himself. And then there's a brief interlude, and then there's this waking up period where he wakes up and he realizes what happened the day before when he castrated himself, and he thinks back to when he had been a young man, he had been an athlete, he had been the envy of people, and now what is he? He's castrated himself, so he's no longer a man, and so there's this whole gender identity crisis going on, and he feels regret at what happened, and of course he can't undo it. But what happens is because he starts expressing doubt, Cybele sends some lions, and the lions basically chase him into the woods. So the point is, he regrets what he did. He apparently is rethinking what he should have done, and the whole worship of Cybele. But Cybele, of course, is not going to let him go, which is how the poem ends. Now, I wouldn't say this is an attack on religion, but I think it is, from a Roman perspective, a sort of like there's something about ecstatic religion that gives the Romans the willies. And even Catullus, who's very liberal, he still feels the willies about this. I think it's a very impressive poem, and it's very memorable. You don't sort of forget that opening. The final thing in chapter 9 is the Nachleben section, the reception section, and this is different than in the first edition. In the first edition, there are versions of the Dionysus story that have made it into modern culture. So there was a play called Dionysus in '69, where they performed the Bacchae, but they did it sort of where there was no distinction between audience and the performers. The audience were sort of on the stage with the performers, and the performers and the audience could actually move in and out throughout the production. So the distinction between audience and the performers was erased. And you get things like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which have a sort of gender bending character, Dr. Frankenfurter. That also it fits in with the sort of Dionysiac spirit. Maurizio decided instead to look at the connection between Dionysus and a figure like Dracula. And I'm not sure she fully gets there, but there are some elements of Dracula that fit. One of the things that Dracula does is he promises us, in effect, eternal life, right? By if he bites you and you become a vampire yourself, then you have eternal life. You're undead. You can't die. And Dionysus, one of the things in the myths about Dionysus is he discovers, for instance, Ariadne, who's thinking of committing suicide, and he rescues her and gives her eternal life. She becomes his wife, and she lives happily ever after, and it becomes immortal. So there is something similar. I don't know that case is fully made here, but it's an interesting idea. It's worth thinking about. There is also the aspect of the seductive quality of Dracula. Most modern versions of Dracula, anything that was done, certainly, after 1960 onwards, Dracula is very handsome, very suave. He's not quite the monster that was in Bram Stoker's story originally. But there is a sort of sexual appeal, and that again is sort of something that would tie him to Dionysus. So that ends chapter 9. Next time we'll be looking at chapter 10, and from chapter 10 onward we'll be looking at heroes. Of the mythology stuff, it is the stuff that I like the most, because I think there's the most interesting stuff with the heroes.